is Reaganomics versus Obamanomics. And folks, this is really worth listening to because this is the contrast between efforts to promote free market capitalism and efforts to promote big government statism. Liberty versus tyranny. And he points out that when Reagan entered office in 1981, he faced actually much worse economic problems than Obama faced in 2009. 3 worsening recessions starting in 1969 were about to culminate in the worst of all in 1981-82, with unemployment soaring into double digits, peaking at 10.8%. At the same time, America suffered roaring double-digit inflation. 11.3% in 1979, 13.5% in 1980. That's 25% in 2 years. The Washington establishment at the time argued that the inflation was now endemic to the American economy and couldn't be stopped, at least not without a calamitous economic collapse. Now, all of this was accompanied by double-digit interest rates, with the prime rate peaking at 21.5% in 1980. I want you to imagine all this going on today. The poverty rate in America started increasing in 1978, eventually climbing by an astounding 33%, from 11.4% to 15.2%. A fall in real median family income began in 1978, snowballed to a decline of almost 10% by 1982. In addition, from 1968 to 1982, the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 70% of its real value, reflecting an overall collapse of stocks. You see, we have to go back to history for context. Because if you listen to Obama and his mouthpieces, Jay Carney among others, you would think the economy at the end of the Bush era and the beginning of the Obama era were the worst. They were not. The Carter years were the worst. And when Reagan stepped into office, it was a disaster, and he had to deal with it. So what did he do? Reagan campaigned on an explicitly articulated 4-point economic program to reverse the slow-motion collapse of the American economy. First, cut tax rates to restore incentives for economic growth, which was implemented first with a reduction in the top income tax rate of 70% down to 50%, and then a 25% across-the-board reduction in income tax rates for everyone. Then the 1986 tax reform reduced tax rates further, leaving just 2 rates, 28% and 15%. The most revolutionary reduction of tax rates in modern American history. 28% and 15%. Reagan would have none of this talk about tax cuts for the rich and defending the middle class. His view was lower them all, cut them to 2 classes, period. Number 2, spending reductions. Yes, spending reductions, including a $31 billion cut in spending in 1981, close to 5% of the federal budget back then, or the equivalent of about $175 billion in spending cuts for the year today. In constant dollars, non-defense discretionary spending declined by 14.4% from 1981 to 1982, by 16.8% from 1981 to 1983. I'm not asking you, obviously, to memorize this stuff. I can't memorize it. But I'm trying to show you, even if you have a general understanding of this, what Reagan did. He slashed taxes and he slashed non-defense spending. In constant dollars, this non-defense discretionary spending never returned to its 1981 level for the rest of Reagan's 2 terms. Even with the Reagan defense buildup, which won the Cold War without firing a shot, total federal spending declined from a high of 23.5% of the GDP in 1983 to 21.3% in 1988 and 21.2% in 1989. That's a real reduction in the size of government relative to the economy of 10%. Number 3, Reagan pushed anti-inflation monetary policy, restraining money supply growth compared to demand to maintain a stronger, more stable dollar. See, and what's happening today is exactly the opposite. Massive printing. And number 4, deregulation. Deregulation saved consumers an estimated $100 billion per year in lower prices. In fact, Reagan's first executive order eliminated price controls on oil and natural gas. Production soared. And aided by a strong dollar, the price of oil declined by more than 50%. Now, these economic policies amounted to the most successful economic experiment in world history. The Reagan recovery started in official records in November 1982 and lasted 92 months. 92 months without a recession until July 1990, when the tax increases of the 1990 budget deal killed it. That was the George H.W. Bush and Democrat Congress tax increases, where he went back on his read my lips, no new taxes pledge. This set a new record for the longest peacetime expansion ever. The previous high in peacetime had been 58 months. Under Reagan, 92 months. Now, during this 7-year recovery, the economy grew by almost 1/3, the equivalent of adding the entire economy of then West Germany, which was the third largest economy in the world at the time. In 1984 alone, real economic growth boomed by 6.8%, the highest in 50 years. Nearly 20 million new jobs were created during the recovery, increasing U.S. civilian employment by almost 20%. Unemployment fell to 5.3% by 1989 from its high of 10.8%. Real per capita disposable income increased by 18% from 1982 to 1989, meaning the American standard of living increased by almost 20% in just 7 years. The poverty rate declined every year from 1984 to 1989, dropping by 1/6 from its peak. The stock market more than tripled in value from 1980 to 1990, a larger increase than in any previous decade. And this is all dismissed as tax cuts for the rich. In the outstanding book, The End of Prosperity, by Art Laffer and Steve Moore, they point out that this Reagan recovery grew into a 25-year boom, with just slight interruptions by shallow, short recessions in 1990 and 2001. Now, they wrote, we call this period 1982 to 2007 the 25-year boom, the greatest period of wealth creation in the history of the planet. In 1980, the net worth assets minus liabilities of all U.S. households and businesses was $25 trillion in today's dollars. By 2007, net worth was just shy of $57 trillion. So adjusting for inflation, more wealth was created in America in a 25-year boom than in the previous 200 years combined. Now, what's so striking about Obamanomics is how it so doggedly pursues the opposite of every one of these planks of Reaganomics. Instead of reducing taxes, Obama is committed to raising the top tax rates of virtually every major federal tax. As already enacted into current law in 2013, the top 2 tax rates will rise by nearly 20%, counting as well Obama's proposed deduction phase-outs, which Boehner has gone along with. The capital gains tax will soar by nearly 60%, counting the new Obamacare taxes going into effect. The total tax rate on corporate dividends will increase by nearly 3 times. The Medicare payroll tax would increase by 62% for the nation's job creators and investors. The death tax rate will go back up to 55%. In his 2012 budget and his recent national budget speech, Obama proposes still more tax increases. Instead of coming into office with spending cuts, Obama's first act was a nearly $1 trillion stimulus bill. In his first 2 years in office, he's already increased federal spending by 28%, and his 2012 budget proposes to increase federal spending by another 57% by 2021. While the Reagan recovery averaged 7.1% economic growth over the first 7 quarters. You got that? It averaged 7.1% growth over the first 7 quarters. The Obama recovery has produced less than half, 2.8%, with the last quarter dismal. After 7 quarters of Reagan recovery, unemployment had fallen 3.3 percentage points from its peak, 7.5%. Not so with Obama. You see, capitalism creates wealth and prosperity and opportunity and jobs. Big government statism destroys them. It's intended to give you a general impression. You had massive economic expansion and growth as a result of across-the-board tax cuts by Reagan in every category: corporate, individual, capital gains. Massive reduction in regulations. In other words, he was unleashing you, the American people, we the people, to create, to invent, to produce. And that's what you have to do. Obama's taken the opposite tack. So what they're good at the White House is propaganda. We're 4 years into this presidency, and they're still talking about George Bush. We're 4 years into this presidency, and Obama takes responsibility for nothing unless he can twist it and turn it into crediting himself for something he hasn't done. Jay Carney today at the White House. He gets into all this stuff. Let's start with cut 2, Mr. Producer, where Carney attacks the tax cuts. Cut 2, go.
Okay? Because after 1993, after that budget plan that was passed, we saw record economic growth. We saw record job creation. We saw the middle class strengthened and made more secure, and we saw vast amounts of wealth created in this country. In the aftermath of those 2 massive tax cuts in 2001 and 2003 that President Bush authored and then Congressman Boehner advocated, we saw stagnation for the middle class. We saw anemic economic growth, and then the worst financial crisis of our lifetimes, not to mention surpluses turned into deficits.
So you see, Jay Carney is a paid propagandist. And so he lies about history, and most of the reporters sitting there have no idea about recent economic history. None. Think about it a second. So tax increases created economic growth. Not only hasn't that ever happened, it didn't happen under Clinton, which I'll get to in a minute. And the Bush tax cuts created stagnation. That's absolutely false. And the Heritage Foundation wrote about this over a year ago. The favorite liberal argument is to attribute the economy's strong performance during the 1990s to Clinton's economic policies. Chief among them was this huge tax increase. Clinton signed his tax hike into law in September 93, the same year he took office. It included an increase of the top marginal tax rate from 31% to 39.6%. Repeal of the cap on the 2.9% Medicare tax. Applying it to every dollar of income instead of being capped to levels like Social Security. He added a 4.3-cent increase in the gas tax, an increase in the taxable portion of Social Security benefits, a hike of the corporate income tax from 34 to 35%, and much, much more. And that created economic growth? No, it didn't, as I will explain as soon as we return. So no, you can't talk about economics without talking about economics. And since it affects all of you, and this is what's going on in Washington right now, we need to address it. What about these great spikes in growth and so forth under Bill Clinton? Well, the economic defense of the Clinton tax hikes does not hold up against the facts. The economy did exhibit strong economic growth during the 1990s. But rapid growth did not occur soon after the tax hike in 1993. It came much later in the decade when Congress cut taxes. The new Republican Congress cut taxes. After the 1993 Clinton tax hike, the economy actually slowed to a point below what one would expect, considering the once-in-a-generation favorable economic climate that existed at the time, with the end of the Cold War and so forth. As for the overall economic recovery, that started well before President Clinton took office. You'll recall I just talked about the massive explosion of economic growth during the Reagan years. In January 1993, the economy was in the 22nd month of expansion following a brief recession from July 1990 to March 1991. From 1993 until 1997, the economy grew at a pedestrian 3.3% per year. It's not a lot. It was not until after the 1997 tax cuts passed by the Republican Congress, a tax cut President Clinton resisted but ultimately signed, that the spectacular growth in the 1990s kicked in at the end of the 1990s. Business investments skyrocketed after the tax cut, and the economy grew at an annualized rate of 4.4%, 33% faster than after the Clinton tax increase from 1997 through the end of the Clinton presidency. Real wages reversed their downward trend and began to grow again 1.7% a year during the same period. Once again, tax cuts saved the day. Unlike Clinton, who entered office with a strong economic wind at his back, Bush 43 came into office on the precipice of a recession caused by the bursting of the dot-com bubble. He entered office on January 2001. The recession actually began in March, 2 months later. In addition to the recession, the peaceful conditions Clinton enjoyed were reversed with the 9/11 attacks. In June 2001, Bush 43 signed into law the first wave of tax cuts. The relief included reductions of the marginal income tax rates and tax relief for families, for example, doubling the child tax credit from $500 to $1,000. To reduce the budgetary impact, Congress phased in the tax cuts over several years. But since those tax cuts were slow to go into effect, they were slow to help the economy. In fact, the economy continued to lose jobs after the tax cuts, even though the recession officially ended in November of that year. But realizing the error of its ways, a few months later, actually a few years later, May 2003, Congress accelerated the tax cuts to make them effective immediately. In addition to reducing the marginal income tax rates to what they are today, Congress also lowered the tax rates on capital gains and dividends. And guess what happened? It was at this point that economic growth took off. Few more numbers, then I'm done with the numbers. From May 2003 until December 2007, when the recession caused by the global financial meltdown occurred, the economy created 8.1 million jobs. By comparison, after the beginning of the 2001 recession and before the tax cuts, the economy was losing 100,000 jobs a month. Now, those opposed to the tax relief argue that it blew a hole in the budget and dramatically increased deficits. You hear all this crap from Jay Carney and his boss. Again, the numbers disprove the argument. While receipts were below the historical level of 18% of GDP in 2003 as a result of the sluggish economy, they rebounded to above their historic norm by 2006 and grew further to a historic level in 2007. And they clearly would have continued growing thereafter had it not been for the housing bust caused by the Community Reinvestment Act. So let me finish it in this way. From 2003 to 2007, the Bush years, the number of tax filers rose by 9.6%. Taxable income by 44%. By contrast, the last 4 years of the previous expansion, 97 to 2001, the numbers grew by 6.4% and 23.6% respectively. All right, enough numbers. What's the point? The Reagan tax cuts, deep, broad, covering individual income taxes, corporate income taxes, capital gains taxes, slashing regulations, 25 years of economic growth like humanity has never seen before. Under Bill Clinton, there was no significant economic growth until the Republican Congress, the new Republican Congress, imposed, pushed for tax cuts. The great economic growth under Bill Clinton occurred at the end of his term as a result of the Republican Congress's demands for tax cuts. George W. Bush comes into office in a recession. What happens? Tax cuts. They don't have a lot of an effect because they're spread out over too long of a period of years. Congress reverses course, institutes them immediately a few years later. What happens? Broad economic growth, increase in family income, increase in job production. And then in 2008, what happens? Well, you not only have a global recession, but we're hit with the housing bubble as a result of liberal Democrat policies from Carter to Clinton with the Community Reinvestment Act. It explodes. No tax cut could fix that. And then Obama's elected. And what does he do? Massive spending. Massive deficits. Massive growth of government. Massive hiring of government employees. And what's it gotten us? Nothing. And what does Obama want to do today? Massive tax increases, in addition to the massive tax increases already in place under Obamacare. Just the first wave of massive tax increases. He wants massive new spending. And the disaster that this is will be felt not immediately, but soon thereafter. This economy, as sick as it is, because Obama has his foot on its throat, will become even sicker. It's a very good piece by Daniel Halper. And he points out, referring to the minority side of the Senate Budget Committee, that's Senator Jeff Sessions, Obama's plan, the plan that he's proposing now, will add at least $8.6 trillion to the debt by the time, by 2022. He suggests $400 billion in deficit reduction would be achieved by a $1.6 trillion tax hike. With Obama's latest plan, debt in 2022 is expected to be $25.4 trillion. Otherwise, in 10 years, it's expected to be $25.8 trillion. In other words, his plan is not a plan at all. He wants to spend more money. Massively increase the debt. This isn't a plan, ladies and gentlemen. This is a disaster. So Obama would take the tax increases that he's demanding, $1.6 trillion, and spend $1.2 trillion of that on a variety of projects. Increased spending is where the vast majority of the new taxes would go. So we're talking about $25.4 trillion, if their numbers even hold up, as a new national debt, not even including unfunded liabilities, versus $25.8 trillion, so a $400 billion difference. And when you're talking about $25 trillion, it's irrelevant. He has no intention of reducing spending at all. Now I'll go back to the macro point I made the other day. Obama and his party represent big government. They do not represent the people. Oh, yes, they represent some people. That is, some people who require for their own needs or demand for their own needs a big, massive government that takes money from you and gives it to them. But Obama doesn't represent hardworking Americans. Obama represents government. Right now, given our economic condition, we need to unleash the private sector. What does Obama want to do to it? Further enslave it, punish it, coerce it, attack it. You're sitting there saying, well, gee, doesn't he have children? Doesn't he? His children will be perfectly fine. His family will be perfectly fine. Look at them. They're about to take a $4 million trip. They don't suffer the ravages of a bad economy. The powerful, the masterminds, they never do. They use the wealth of the nation and what's left of it to live perfectly well. They don't have to suffer the consequences of their own policies, and they never do. So just keep in mind that every time we've had significant tax cuts, from Reagan to the Republican Congress under Clinton to George W. Bush, we've had huge economic expansion, wealth creation, that is prosperity, opportunities, and jobs. And the so-called middle class Obama likes to claim to represent, their incomes go up. Their incomes go up. All right, that's the economics lessons for the day. But I thought it was very, very important because we're going to play some audio to put it all in context and bring it all together. Jeff King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, listening on the great WABC. Go.
How you doing? First-time caller. Very interesting show. Somebody told me to look at a website. I'm not plugging it, but Obama.
All right, then don't plug it. How may I help you?
Well, I'm listening to, and I got to say, I've never heard a more revisionist, one-sided rewriting of history than what you espouse to your readers.
Where was I wrong?
Where were you wrong? Well, you had the technological advance during Clinton. That accounted for all the jobs that exploded.
Oh, actually, I didn't say that accounted for all the jobs.
You did.
What is it with you liberals? Why do you... I mean, people can go back and download this program and listen to exactly what I said. They can look at the source material that I used. So why do you put words in my mouth?
Since Reagan.
Are you even listening to... Sir, wake up. Hello?
Yeah.
Did you even hear what I said?
Yeah, I did. I don't know if you understood what you said.
Oh, yeah. That's very complicated.
Well, no, we can have a conversation.
All right, jackass. We're not going to have a conversation because I don't like you. You want to know why? You're a punk. You call this program and you twist what I say, then you're condescending like most of you liberal morons. You're dragging this country into the abyss. You don't like facts and statistics, do you? Clinton was a disaster. In addition to being a pervert, he was a disaster. Your man Obama, he's a bigger disaster. He's driving this nation off the cliff. Now, you got that? Now, get lost. Now, you liberals, you want to have a conversation? I'm more than happy to do it. But if you're a punk, that ain't going to happen. Particularly when you're a moron. Oh, it's so complicated to understand this stuff. Gee, I wish I were a liberal. Let me see. $16.3 trillion in debt, unfunded liabilities anywhere from $70 to $120 trillion. This jerk votes for Obama. Obama wants more spending, more tax increases, and it's so complicated Mark can't understand it. Gee willikers. No. Only mental patients can understand what's happening to this country and vote for people who do this sort of thing. Snide, punk, mental patients. All right. There, I vented. I think in many ways it is hopeless, isn't it, Mr. Producer? I just think there's 40 or 45% of the people out there, whether they pay taxes or not, who just are never ever going to accept reality, the laws of economics. They're not going to do it. They believe tax increases create economic growth. They believe massive deficit spending creates economic growth and is healthy for a society. They believe certain people earn too much, and we should be able to use the law to steal their money and give it to people who haven't earned it. That's the mentality. And they're going to defend it to the end. And let me tell you something, pal. My goal isn't to persuade you, it's to crush you. It's to crush you and people like you. Because if I don't, and we don't, this country's doomed. You get that? Or is that too complicated? I'll be right back.
Mark Levin.
Hello, my friends. It be me, Mark Levin. Our number, 877-381-3811, 877-381-3811. I'm going to continue a little bit down this road, and then I want to move along because we have a story breaking at cnsnews.com that our public schools, owned and operated by the Democrat Party, that's right, the NEA and so forth, are racist. And worse. And I don't want to miss that. That's very interesting. So Jay Carney today, the spokes idiot for Obama. Let's listen to one more clip from him, how he explains history. Cut one, go.
In 1993, I know because I was there and I covered it, John Boehner got up and said, if we pass the Clinton budget plan, we'll lose jobs, the economy will shrink, inflation will go up. Verbatim, he said that, or close to verbatim. I don't have the exact quote. I had it on my computer.
Stop. That's interesting. Verbatim, but maybe not verbatim. I mean, it's either verbatim or it's not. It's either exact or verbatim. Maybe it's not. It's close, but I have. So, in 1993, I know because I was there and I covered it, John Boehner got up and said, if we pass the Clinton budget plan, that is the tax increases, and they were massive tax increases, we'll lose jobs, the economy will shrink, inflation will go up. Well, it did. All those things happened. It wasn't until the Republicans came to town and took over Congress because the people reacted to Hillary Care in such a negative way with a huge tax cut that Clinton was forced to sign, that the economy began to expand at a significant rate. Oh, I know this really infuriates you liberals out there. This drives you nuts. I mean, nuttier than you already are. Continue, Mr. Producer, go.
In 2001, he fiercely advocated for the massive tax cuts that President Bush insisted on. Again in 2003, that went disproportionately to the wealthy.
Stop. Actually, they didn't go disproportionately to the wealthy. The cut was from 39.6% to 36% in the top bracket. The lowest bracket, it went from 15% to 10%. Do you have to be a complete economic illiterate to work for the Obama administration? I think so. It is a bigger percentage reduction, 15% to 10%, than 39.6% to 36%. And he should know. He was there. Go ahead, Mr. Producer.
Would lead to economic growth and a better and a middle class that was better off.
Stop. And it did. We had significant economic growth after those tax cuts. An expansion of median income. Let's hear what else Jay Carney had to say, because, of course, he was there. Go ahead.
That while I personally am very fond of John Boehner, his record of predicting what would happen if certain policies, economic policies, were instituted is abysmal.
Really? It's abysmal. Well, let's see. We're living through the Obama economic explosion. Massive job increase, isn't there? No? Massive expansion of the economy. Well, no. A strong dollar here and abroad. No. The housing market is just magnificent. What? See, you see, Mr. Carney, if I may call you that. Is it Art Carney or is this Jay Carney, Mr. Producer? Oh, it's Jay Carney. You see, Mr. Carney, we're living through the nirvana that is the Obama years. And you guys deflect and you spin because you're propagandists. No, Bush didn't do this. No. James Buchanan didn't do this. Nobody did this, except you guys. These are your policies. They've been in place long enough, and the fruit of your policies is rotten fruit. This is why I spent time in the first hour going through this in some detail. So you, unlike other audiences, you will be encumbered with the truth and with the facts. And the information I'm using after the program will be up on our website, correct, Mr. Producer? And you can look at the links yourself and you can do your own investigation. That's the great thing about modern technology. So they keep pushing these lies and these myths about how tax increases create all this wealth, tax increases balance budgets, tax increases do this and that. They do no such thing, particularly when you have a guy like Obama who wants to use the taxes to spend more money. There's no relationship between taxing and paying down the debt. None whatsoever. So Boehner's at his press conference today, had a press conference, and most of us didn't hear it because most of us work for a living. Now, that said, I wanted you to hear some of it. Not a lot of it, just some of it. Cut 3, go.
Republicans want to solve this problem by getting the spending line down. The president wants to pretend that spending isn't the problem. That's why we don't have an agreement. The chart depicts what I've been saying for a long time now. Washington has a spending problem that can't be fixed with tax increases alone. The right answer is to start cutting spending, addressing our debt, and paving the way for long-term economic growth. Unfortunately, the White House is so unserious about cutting spending that it appears willing to slow walk any agreement and walk our economy right up to the fiscal cliff. Doing that puts jobs in our country in danger.
You know what's interesting about this to me? The Boehner proposal doesn't do what Boehner says he wants to do. Boehner comes to the table all by himself, in public, right after the election, announces Obama won, Obamacare is the law. Then he has to try and reverse course. We're only one half of one branch of three branches of government. I wish to remind Mr. Boehner that judiciary has nothing to do with this, at least not right now. So you're one half of two relevant branches of government, and you're the one half of the one branch of government, that is Congress, where spending, taxing, and borrowing has to be initiated. So you have enormous clout. You have enormous power. I don't ever remember Tip O'Neill saying in the face of Ronald Reagan, well, I'm only one half of one branch of three branches of government. No. They fight. That's number one. Number two, what Boehner has proposed to do doesn't comport with what he's saying. Look, he says we have a spending problem. Can't be fixed with tax increases alone. It can't be fixed with tax increases at all. At all. So what Boehner should have proposed was significant spending cuts Also, significant tax reform and tax cuts to grow the economy. Take away the class warfare argument from Obama and leave town. Throw it into the Senate's lap. So his own comments to me don't comport with what he's actually proposed and what he's actually done. Let's try this one. Cut 4, Boehner, today at his press conference. Go.
Real revenue growth is critically important as long as real cuts in spending if we're going to solve our long-term fiscal problem. As I said 5 weeks ago, the election wasn't a mandate to raise taxes on small businesses. It was a mandate for both parties to work together to take on the big challenges that our country is facing. Republicans are ready and eager to do just that. We made a reasonable offer. It's now up to the White House to show us how they're going to cut spending and give us the balanced agreement that the president has talked about for weeks.
Can you see why this man doesn't generate excitement and support among the American people? Can you see why? He's reading his comments. He's reading them like he has to go through this, not like he actually believes in anything. They talk about this balanced approach. Obama talks about a balanced approach. What he ought to be talking about is economic growth, wealth creation, producing jobs. But he can't do it. He cannot do it. Let's try one more. Cut 5, go.
I've been pushing all year for us to address this problem. But here we are at the 11th hour, and the president still isn't serious about dealing with this issue right here. It's this issue, spending. Now, you go back to and want to talk about polling, most Americans would agree that spending is a much bigger problem than raising taxes. They want us to deal with this in a responsible way.
Yeah, but you want to raise taxes. You said $800 billion. You're willing to go to $1.2 trillion. That's a massive tax increase on the private sector. And you see, this is the way we ought to talk. That is a massive tax increase, not on this category of taxpayers and that category. It's a massive tax increase on the private sector where wealth is removed from bank accounts, from investments, from real estate, from businesses, small, medium, and large, sucked out of the private sector, washed through, laundered through the federal government, and redistributed to Barack Obama's favorite citizens. And redistribute to Barack Obama's favorite causes. We are sucking money out of the private sector and using it for more failed government programs. And even while we're doing that, we're still borrowing over $1 trillion a year. Why doesn't he get up there and say, the president wants once again, in the 5th year, deficit spending of over $1 trillion. We will not tolerate that, and we're not going to support it any longer. Why doesn't he just pick that off? But he doesn't do it. I told you, I've been saying all along. Been saying what all along? You know what? That's enough. This is depressing. That's your Republican leader.